Hello, everyone. Welcome to July 12th edition of the Kubernetes Steering Committee meeting. This is a makeup for our public that we missed on July 5th. Welcome to any members of the community that we have here. Looks like we have several of you. And of course, welcome to all of our steering committee members. It's nice to see you as well. Yes, we do have a code of conduct today, as always. Please be excellent to each other. This is a governance meeting, so we do conduct business a tad differently than some of our SIG meetings where we technically argue with each other. We governance argue with each other here. So there is a tad bit of difference. There are a little bit of rules today since I'm running this show. I want to make sure that everybody's heard. So one thing that's really important is context. We have a full agenda today. So if you are on the agenda and you have one of these items that you were bringing up, you get 3 minutes to give us context. That context is where you are, what you need, and just a general discussion for where we are today with the issue. I do see some SIG business on the agenda. And I did try to bump that up a little bit, like SIG service catalog, you're at the bottom, I bumped you up, just take note to that. But other than that, let's get into the show. Cool. All right, so first things up, we have better selection of chairs and TLs. I'll share my screen too as we're talking. Who wants to take the context for this? Dims, I know you're lurking. Either Dims or somebody else to want to take the context for Dims on this one.
I can at least tee it up. So there was a, there's been some ongoing discussions. We've had discussions on this topic for quite a while, but there were some discussions around how SIG chairs are selected and around potentially putting in term limits for SIG chairs. Right now, there isn't a standardized way across the community for selecting SIG chairs. Some of them are done via like nominated by current SIG chairs and SIG leadership, and then like consensus achieved from the SIG itself. There have been specific examples where like a role like a chair or tech lead, there's been like a mini election that's been set up within a SIG. There's been various examples that have happened as far as how to do it, but there isn't like a complete uniform way of doing this across the project. So the discussion is kind of around, should there be a uniform way of doing this? Should there be more resources provided for SIGs to be able to select their leaders? Do we potentially make the like right now the tech lead role in a SIG is optional? Do we make that potentially mandatory? Is that something that should be mandatory across SIGs? And then some thoughts and discussions around life cycles around these roles. So is there, there are a number of SIG chairs or tech leads that have been in that position for a significant amount of time. Is there some sort of life cycle policy that we should have for those type of roles to allow for basically to allow those the folks that are in those roles having like, okay, here's like a defined like potential exit period that either you need to like refigure things out, or just make sure that you have a succession plan in place. There's been some healthy discussion on a number of these issues on the issue itself, but I think it was wanted to be brought up here to kind of continue these discussions and see if there's any conclusions that can be drawn.
Any members of steering like to say a word? Questions, concerns, comments? So
I thought that was a good summary. It seems like there are three sort of categories or directions this is going. One is like the mechanisms for proposing and selecting leads. And the second is the terms and term limits. And then the third was sort of like the TL role being optional, mandatory. I think all of those are great conversations to have. I think it's difficult to have all three at the same time. So I wonder if we could maybe split those into distinct things and focus on maybe order them, like say which ones do we think are most important, and then drive one of those to a conclusion.
All in favor for splitting the issue into three? All right. I'm +1 as well. All right. Do we have any conclusions on any of the three items that Jordan mentioned, either mechanism, term limits, TL role?
I think the TL role would probably be the easiest one to start moving forward on. For what it's worth, I am in favor of making the TL role mandatory.
And then keeping on the TL prong, do any steering members have anything in opposition to that? Do you think that's not required, or we should not require that?
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask the question, like when we talk about required, the one thing that is not clear from the issue is by required, does that mean an individual can hold both roles at the same time? Because right now, the way our governance docs are worded, if a particular SIG lacks a tech lead role, then the responsibilities that would normally be a part of that role kind of devolve back to the chairs. If we're talking about requirement, do we want to allow somebody to hold both roles at the same time? Does that defeat the purpose? Does it matter? I'm not sure.
I don't know if you're using hands, Paris, or we should just jump all over each other.
Yeah, just go ahead and jump in, Jordan. Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't seen any, but go ahead and jump in.
Okay. All right. I'm in favor of requiring a name associated with tech lead, just to be clear about function across SIGs. Like, it's really confusing when someone says, oh, acting as chair of X, I am doing Y. And we have to go look and say, oh, well, does this SIG have tech leads? Have they separated out the tech lead role? Oh, you're a chair. This is more a tech lead decision. It's just confusing. Like, it's sort of confusing to understand who's doing what. To ease the transition, I think it would make sense to say SIGs that currently just have one person in that role, that person is de facto serving as chair and tech lead. And so I don't want to increase overhead for SIGs who are currently being successful. So I would say the same individual can hold both roles, but we need to recognize its distinct responsibilities. And that makes it simpler to say, like, oh, all the tech leads do X and all the chairs do Y. And in some SIGs, the same person can hold both, but at least it starts to clarify, like, these are two buckets of responsibilities. And if you want to do both and you can do both, and there's no one else in your SIG who is able or wants to do that, like, that's fine. But it makes it more consistent when we're working across SIGs and just understanding, like, all right, everyone in this list is chairs and they can do X, and everyone in this list is TLs and they can do Y. So.
Anybody else from steering want to tackle the TL discussion?
As far as like how we move forward on this, I think, like, as we indicated, I think we should kind of split these 3 discussion items out into separate, like 3 separate action items. But I wonder, should we have a feedback cycle here with the active chairs and tech leads, and say like, hey, we're opening, have a request for comment for this like period of X number of weeks. Please give us feedback on these 3 specific items, and how you feel about them and how it applies to your SIG and that kind of stuff, and then see if we can draw some conclusions as far as if there's consensus among the community to move forward on these 3 items. Because I think at this point, from the discussion that's on the issue right now, I don't know if I can draw a conclusion as far as like, do we have consensus on moving in any particular direction? But I think what this discussion does define fairly well is, here's the 3 key suggestions that have at least some momentum behind them that could improve the space.
And then dare we talk about the term limits on this call? As everyone knows, I'm in favor. I did ours.
Yeah. I thought the discussion on the issue was a good one. And like, before you have term limits, you have to define terms. And so my instinct would be to start with terms. I think that has a lot of benefits, even apart from like a limit on number of terms, because it adds clarity to what you're sort of signing up for when you step into a role, and it gives an opportunity to reevaluate, even if it's just personal reevaluation. So like the term and then term limit discussion, I'm in favor of terms. That's where I would start.
Anyone else?
I'm generally in favor as well, but I would like to seek feedback from the chairs and tech leads that would be impacted, and then see if if we populate this discussion a little bit wider, if we get more of a clear sense from the community, if they back that as well.
Nikita, Bob, any comments?
I am also largely in favor of terms, but agree that we need to get consensus from all the leads before we do anything along those lines.
Agree. This also seems like a good fit for the community meeting, so not just the existing chairs and tech leads, but maybe prospective or like people who are interested in being chairs and TLs too. So just cast a wider net.
All right, so what I'm hearing is we're going to break this issue into 3. Dims, do you want to take that as an action since you originally filed it, or would you like me to do it today? Either one is fine. I'll put Dims Terrace. And then the next thing I heard is that folks want chairs and tech leads to weigh in on each separately with a time box, and then potentially get on the community meeting schedule for discussion. All right. Looks like we're ready to wrap this item up. Does anybody have any last call? Also, is there any members of the community that would like to weigh in on this?
I will note we didn't talk about the actual mechanism for how leads are selected or proposed. So having terms without that mechanism is a little weird, but I do think there's benefit to saying every X period, leads have an opportunity to step aside, reevaluate, re-up, whatever, even with our current selection mechanisms. But if we were ordering these, I would probably put the like proposal selection stuff ahead of like strict terms, because it doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise.
How we select the chairs may be the one that like we need the most feedback on, because again, looking through the discussion that's already been had, that's the one that that at least my interpretation is, I feel like has the least clarity as far as the specific mechanics around it. And while, you know, the prevailing suggestion on how we could do that better is voting, the problem there that nobody really seems to have a clear answer is then defining who gets a vote. If you go that method beyond just, you know, the current state of the world, which is put it out for like a lazy consensus call, and then the current chairs and tech leads, you know, make a call on if there's consensus.
All right. And then Aaron, I see your hand, Mr. Member of the Community.
Yes. Put it down or something. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like with all of these things, the context I lack is data to help understand the state of the state. So y'all offhandedly mentions that, you know, some SIGs do this or that, but I don't have like a table or I'll admit, I have not read your wonderful summary of the awesome annual reports, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say that how each SIG chooses their leadership was not something that rolled up out of that. It would be cool to see that. I think
It was, though.
it was. Cool.
It's in the membership theme section. It's not a table, though. It's just
Okay.
sentences, words.
I could go read that and be corrected, but I feel like, okay, terms. I don't know how long any of the chairs have been around. The overwhelming thing that I have been hearing in back channels is like, what specific problems are we trying to solve with this? And I appreciate that we're having the discussion without getting into those concrete issues. But I think some data on some of this stuff might inform what we need to do. And I'm saying this because I know one of the leads who's been around since EPOC. Like, I would also wonder what the enforcement mechanism might look like for term limits. If you have a problem child like me who just has been around forever. I'm happy to help if I can. I provided data on which SIGs do and do not have tech limits, for example. But I think I'm going to assume you all are having the discussion in private, perhaps, of like what specific problems is this trying to address? Because overwhelming, my time on steering taught me that attempting to do sort of top-down mandates requires the will and bandwidth to enforce those. And more of what I have seen happen is kind of a laissez-faire delegation approach, like kind of letting each SIG do what is most appropriate for them with the check and balance of if their behavior meets our community norms. That's my 2 cents.
And then I will make sure on the 3 issues that we break down that I'm going to include data for each one. And I'll also include the why we're doing this for each one and what we're trying to solve. Is that cool, Aaron? All right, let's package this topic up and keep going on the action items, and then we'll shelve it for our next meeting. All right, thank you, y'all. Our next one is the roles visibility PR. That's on sort of a similar as we get into like members and things like that and what people do here. Let me share my screen. I'll go ahead and give the extremely quick context. This is a PR that's addressing roles. The problems that we were trying to solve were people getting visibility within the project that are doing hard work, that are not in SIG XAML, like chairs and tech leads. Also just trying to establish some uniformity as well as adoption of other roles within other SIGs. We heard from SIG chairs and tech leads that this would be helpful, as well as other members of the community. So I'm going to actually, I tried to pile two things onto this PR, as you can tell. So I'm going to go ahead and take out the tech lead piece based on comments from steering. And then here is this is really where the meat and potatoes comes into play with the addition of the other roles piece in SIG governance. So it's just listing why we're doing this and and links to example rule books for other SIGs. And it also talks about how if the other role assumes any kind of duty from chair or tech lead that's not temporary, example running meetings full-time, then that would need to get approval from steering. Anything that's taking away a duty from a chair or tech lead onto someone else would need to be approved by steering. Everything else just needs to be on a SIG's README. That's my 3 minutes context. Any steering members have questions, concerns, or comments?
Yeah, I think if we address both Dim's suggestion on moving the musts to the top and the change that you've already identified as far as removing the tech lead requirement, it's completely good for me, and I think we should just ship it.
Others, especially those who disagree.
Looks good to me. I also left a comment about, I mean, we discussed this in some previous steering meeting, that we would send an email to KDEV with a 1-week lazy consensus. So if we could add that in, that would be great too.
And Aaron, I see something in chat about data. Can you elaborate on that?
So I once again don't understand how many SIGs have custom roles or are sort of blocked or impacted by this. And I don't understand the scope or breadth of the custom roles that different SIGs have.
I think this is largely recognizing something that some SIGs are already doing. So SIG release, SIG architecture are two examples of SIGs that have subprojects and have pretty well-defined processes for those. And what this is trying to do is surface that and make that visible up in the top-level SIG document. So currently it's done in an ad hoc way, in an unstructured way, sort of in the markdown docs for the SIGs. And this is saying that if you're going to have roles and subprojects, like put them here. So it makes it more discoverable. And something like notifying KDEV, like, oh, you're defining things for your SIG, like just get visibility to it. That's my impression. Is that correct?
No context or like super old school take is like, I thought this is what revisions to a SIG's charter were for. Because the charter sort of defined like the deviations from the standard governance thing. And then I thought we kind of had an established process for changes to charter that needed sign off by steering.
So at least
There's,
sorry.
Go ahead, Bob.
We worded it so like a lot of the roles, aren't necessarily direct chartered responsibilities. The ones that would potentially impact a chartered, well, I should revise it a little bit. We asked that if any of the roles of the chairs or TLs have any of their tasks delegated out, it would be a chartered update, with that part requiring approval from steering. The other part can be a bit more ad hoc, like it doesn't necessarily need steering approval for a group to create a role, like for Contribex, like the events lead for a contributor summit. I don't think that necessarily needs additional steering approval for that sort of thing.
And
Yeah, I
to
would
Yeah,
agree
the
with Bob.
charter is more about like what a SIG is responsible for, and this is more about how it's organizing itself to accomplish that.
The execution of it.
And we're trying to also grant clarity around like what changes. So specifically, we're calling out here if you're making a change to a role or responsibility that would normally be a chair or tech lead and something that is covered by the charter and covered by the SIG governance process, calling out like those things require a charter change. And if it doesn't fall into that bucket, then it doesn't require a charter change, and a SIG can kind of go ahead with it because it's within the scope of what they're already responsible for.
Right. So Aaron, to your concern about like governance changes, this is primarily oriented at roles that aren't governance related, they're operations related. And so we're just trying to make it clear that SIGs who do that, which is encouraged, it's a good way to organize stuff and bring people in, like how we recommend they do that. And operations roles, definitions and surfacing that's not governance. It doesn't need steering approval. It doesn't need a charter change.
So yes, totally. I was just advocating for laissez-faire, and I think this is totally in line with that. The like little whatever niggle I have in my head, I don't know what the right word for that is. The little itch that I want to scratch is like production readiness reviewer, for example. Seems like it's taking a pretty like it's kind of a bottleneck, or like the API reviewer process. It's kind of bottlenecky. And that's the sort of thing where like I feel like that's gotten a fair amount of visibility through just general involvement in the release process. But I'm wondering if like those are the sorts of things that are totally fine to go under steering's radar. Or if that kind of like sort of putting a choke point on the project in those sorts of areas is the sort of thing that needs steering's involvement.
I would say
I don't want to like drive you away from consensus. So
I would say that like in those particular cases, at least my initial kind of like view of them is those are within the scope of something that's already delegated to SIG architecture as part of their charter, as like these are areas of responsibility for SIG architecture. How SIG architecture goes about naming and defining those roles, at least in my view at the moment, is like that is up to SIG architecture how they end up organizing it. SIG architecture is in a unique place where they are delegated like cross project responsibilities, and they have that ability to block in ways that like not a lot of SIGs have. But the scope of those roles doesn't necessarily exceed what their already chartered abilities are. So if they chose to organize those in a slightly different way, then it doesn't, to me, I don't necessarily feel that needs steering approval. I would hope in that case that SIG architecture would be making sure that they have consensus and are like engaging other stakeholders themselves. But at a like core governance level, I don't think that necessarily needs an extra layer of steering review, as long as they aren't exceeding the bounds of their charter.
Oh, Nikita or Bob? Anybody at last call for this? It sounds like we have some next steps. Last call from steering, and then any other community members would like to weigh in on this? Sounds like what I'm hearing is we're taking off the tech lead line at the top. We're going to open up a new PR for that one and decide and discuss there for that line. Put the musts at the top, and then it sounds like we've got a general consensus to merge. True or false?
Nikita also brought up the
Oh, yep.
the KDev dev.
Yep. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nikita. Apologies. All right. And then service catalog. Hey, y'all. You want to give us some, who's on to give us some context? Anybody? Or the liaison on?
Yeah, most of us are here waiting in the wings, as it were.
Hey.
So just by way of explaining sort of the background behind what's going on in Service Catalog. Service Catalog, the project itself has sort of fallen into disuse. A lot of the various stakeholders in the project have moved on mostly to operator-based solutions for the things they used to use Service Catalog for. So it's just seen a lot less use these days than it used to in the past. That said, there is still a need for a little bit of the secret sauce behind Service Catalog, the idea of bindings, of there being some programmatic way to attach provision services to running applications. And that's what the service binding idea really is about taking that little bit out of Service Catalog and implementing it in a generic fashion that can be used with more things than just Service Catalog. Hopefully that's a good summary. If any of the other people would like to chime in.
Yeah, pretty much. So originally Service Catalog was created as a SIG around a very specific piece of software. And since then, a few other projects have been adopted, namely the mini broker and the library. And we were thinking of adopting the binding spec that was more native to Kubernetes than the generic Asbabi that is used by Cloud Foundry and Heroku. So to reflect that, we would want to extend the scope of the SIG beyond just the Asbabi specific implementation to envelop solutions that could do similar stuff, but would be more Kubernetes native. So that's the gist of the charter change.
Liaison, do you have anything to say, or does anybody from steering have anything?
So I forgot who's the liaison, but I've been talking to the Service Catalog folks. One thing we did discuss was that it might make more sense for service binding to go to SIG apps instead, and maybe like y'all could elaborate on this. So like it's not clear to me why. I think we talked about this, but like maybe for the rest of the folks, it's not clear like why the service binding project needs to go to SIG Service Catalog, because if I understand correctly, there isn't really a coupling between the two, like the service binding project and Service Catalog, because none of them depend on each other, and the service bindings project must be able to continue to bind services that are not provisioned by an open source broker API.
I'll jump in here a little bit. The specification itself is designed to act as a bridge between the service world, some sort of thing that needs to expose endpoints and credentials, and applications, and therefore doesn't particularly sit in either, right? Like it does actually, its scope encapsulates details around the service side outside of applications themselves. So from our perspective, when we first started exploring and reaching out to SIGs, we didn't have a preference for either one. We reached out to SIG apps first, in fact, and got no response. And after a couple of months without a response there, we reached out to SIG Service Catalog, which was more receptive to it. I don't think that we have a strong preference in either direction for where we'd like to land. It feels like in both cases, SIG charters will need to be expanded to accept them, but we've had really great work working with the SIG Service Catalog team so far, and getting that kind of adoption to happen.
Any other steering members? Questions for service catalog?
Yeah, I had, this is Jordan. I had been on the charter update PR review, and most of my questions with the expansion, I started having trouble sort of telling for a particular topic whether it would fall under this or under SIG apps. And so I also had similar questions about, like, would it be simpler to sort of model this project or this external repo or whatever as like a subproject of SIG apps? One of the things we try to avoid is charters that overlap in unclear ways, so that for a particular future decision, it makes it harder for someone in the future to say, oh, I want to do a thing, like, do I go to SIG apps about this, or do I go to SIG service catalog about this? And so right now, the current state of SIG service catalog is that it's very, very scoped. And this sort of makes it much less scoped. So in terms of just benefit for contributors as well, like the overhead of running a SIG is non-trivial. And so if the thing you're mostly interested in is like a SIGs repo to do stuff with, and like a way to tie into the Kubernetes project, a sub-project of an existing SIG is probably going to be much lighter weight for you and give you all the same benefits of being able to like exist in the Kubernetes SIGs repos and stuff like that.
Sorry, just to clarify, by expanding the scope, we just remove the specifics of ASBAPI, but staying within the same major area. So that shouldn't really cause any more confusion.
I'm not sure I agree. Maybe I'm just easily confused. I mean, at the point where it talks about enabling application developers to consume cloud provider or self-hosted services, like that's very general, and I could easily see it either being under SIG Network or SIG apps. Like SIG Network has the sort of endpoint service discovery side of things, and SIG apps has like the application custom types and ways to sort of have define a bundle of stuff that, you know, inject in configuration values and things into your apps. And so the goal that this is describing seems like a good goal. It just is really hard for me to see like a space between SIG Network and SIG apps where this is its own distinct thing that can be owned.
Yeah, and just to jump in here, like the expansion of the service catalog, like charter, like as the charter is defined today, it's very specific in scope that it's like the thing that you're enabling communication with is like an off cluster service. And in that way, you're not necessarily overlapping with apps and network that are both enabling consuming of services on cluster. So the specific wording there around expanding to like configuration and discovery and connectivity of services in cluster, that to me is like the very specific, like that takes the scope from like being very closely defined to very wide and now overlapping with other SIGs and other defined responsibility areas in apps and network. As far as those pieces, at least I say that, and like if I'm misunderstanding, like I would love to hear if there's like clarity that could be provided. Like is that actually the case that's what's happening?
Not really, because basically the idea behind this is it's still about provisioning, say, stateful. The confusion, I think that the biggest confusion is caused by the multitude of meanings when people say service. That just means a lot of things at the same time. So when we refer to services in, say, OSBAPI context, which is why I'm saying removing the OSBAPI just allows you to tackle the exact same problem that OSBAPI does, but maybe in a different way that is more native to Kubernetes, like using a set of custom resources and whatnot. So basically, we're talking about, so in this context, a service is a database or a message bus or something like that, where your application operator would say, hey, I want this message bus, and I want to do that in a standard way. So for Kubernetes as a platform, I think it's way out of scope to do that as a standard thing, because there could be many options here, OSBAPI being one of them. Does that make sense? Does that clarify your concerns?
It does make the space a bit clearer, but I'm not sure that it necessarily answers like the most pertinent question is like, where does this go? And I think you know, Jordan made a comment in the chat about engaging and having like a focused discussion on this between apps, network, and service catalog, and try and understand and get feedback as far as like making sure specifically that like each of the three SIGs and their respective charters are clear, that we know, okay, so in this case, where does this particular effort go? And where is, and hopefully minimize overlap, and where there is interaction, making sure that there is like very clear clear guidelines around that as far as like when one group needs to interact with another group.
Yeah, I just try to think in terms of like concrete. Oh, go ahead, Nikita.
Oh, no, Aaron was making a point in the chat, so I thought he would be interested in talking about it.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I just there's a thing called a working group that allows multiple SIGs to collaborate on an ongoing basis on some kind of effort. For example, there was the apply working group, which helped implement server-side apply, which required collaboration between API machinery and actually, I don't know what other SIGs, but other SIGs. I'm wondering if, like, essentially, I'm kind of wondering what the concern is over the idea of what if service catalog was not a SIG anymore? Like, what is lost by doing that? Because if there's interest in just really kind of driving this forward and making progress, I feel like we have seen good success with working groups. And it can also kind of table or defer the conversation about like, yes, but where should this really actually truly live? Like that can be kind of sorted out as things proceed. But it is very clearly a concept that's used for like, this work is going to require coordination and input from multiple SIGs. So I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Is there a like to the service catalog and service binding folks, like specifically like what is the goal as far as what we're trying to find? Are you looking for a permanent home for an existing piece of software? Is there like or is this more like a design, like, hey, we have a design that we need to go and implement and want to coordinate between groups? Like where are we as far as the maturity curve for this particular initiative?
So I'd say from the service binding specification, we're quite mature at this point, relatively stable, and we're looking for a home inside of Kubernetes to land. We think that the service catalog is a good option for that, right? Like fundamentally, I agree with Konstantin. Like this is just another variant of how do I get credentials to an application, right? It's not the only place, certainly. Like I'll definitely accept that like apps, SIG apps is another good place. But I think one of the holdups here is if we do choose to land, or if we're adopted, if we want to be adopted by Service Catalog does require an expansion of their charter to sort of make that work. If we'd like for them to get it, we think it's a good home that's in alignment with this. But if that doesn't happen, then like we definitely want to find another place to land.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like because the gray area that exists today for this particular initiative, I think we're probably going to need some charter changes somewhere anyways. Just again, like if we're going with like finding a permanent home for this, I think somebody's probably going to need a charter change no matter what to enable that. But
yeah, and I'm totally sympathetic to that. Like this was by design intended to stretch across sort of the domains that SIG apps would have and that something like SIG Service Catalog would have. So there was never going to be a clear, this is exactly where it needs to go based on existing charters.
I actually have a quick question. Is this just a spec?
It's a spec for now. We plan on having a reference implementation of that specification as well to go along with it. But it is sort of broadly like developed in the open between multiple companies and stuff like that.
The other place that might honestly be a good home for this would be the CNCF if it is just a spec. Well, spec and a reference implementation. Especially if it doesn't quite align with a Kubernetes SIG directly.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons Kubernetes directly seems appropriate for us is the entire specification is built on a foundation of Kubernetes isms, right? It's not something that could more broadly exist in the real world. It specifies CRDs and the interactions of controllers and, depends on, all of sort of the mechanics of the Kubernetes platform itself in order to be useful.
For what it's worth, there are other things in the CNCF like that. Like the CNF working group is essentially doing that right now for network functions.
I did want to bring up one more point, and this was actually what surprised me a little bit when I saw the pull request to expand the charter. Service Catalog, the Service Catalog SIG in general has sort of been less active, and so it surprised me to see an expansion of a SIG that I don't know that there are like up-to-date recorded meetings and sort of the annual report process that just went through, like that's not completed yet. And so I'm hesitant to expand the charter for a SIG that either has been less active or just is, the people in leadership there are pressed for time. And so I know you said you would approach SIG apps about this, but SIG apps has been more active than SIG Service Catalog. And so if all you're looking for is a home for this project, I would tend to lean towards SIG apps just because there are more people involved there and it has been more active. But I think pulling in the folks from SIG apps and SIG Network just to make sure there's clarity about what this is and would be a good next step.
All right, and that ends this discussion, but let's wrap this up with some things that we need to take away. Can we trust the liaisons for apps, network, and Service Catalog to bring this together in an issue to get the feedback? Is that a good next step? And then I
would probably tag them into the charter change and then maybe set up an in-person meeting to force a time bound on it.
All right, I'm putting that down. Okay, and then
and when I say in person, obviously I mean in Zoom.
In Zoom land. And then it sounds like there might be some discussions around, could this be a working group? Could this be hosted in CNCF? And should Service Catalog be a SIG?
Yeah, I think those are orthogonal to the core issue, but like questions that should be asked. I think it's, if I remember correctly, I'm the liaison for service catalog, Bob is apps, and Derek is network.
Look forward to hearing your assessment. All right. So Aaron, I just bumped you up because we are running out of time. So Aaron, you filed an issue for Google Workspace automation and you wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, apologies if you all hear the fire trucks going by. Okay, I come to you hat in hand. First asking who here has read the issue from steering and is familiar with it. I see 3 hands. Okay. The context for everybody else is that there is a, we used to call it G Suite, it's called Google Workspace now. It is a thing that handles calendars, emailing lists, and could handle a whole bunch more, like Google Drive and auditing of document access and things like that. I believe it is also kind of the keys, it is perceived as the keys to the kingdom to like the Kubernetes.io name. Like the GCP organization we have called Kubernetes.io, which hosts all of the community project infrastructure that is funded by the CNCF, is tied to this workspace. And historically, it has, I want to say like 4 or 5 super admins, which are people who are capable of doing anything with it. 3 of those people are Kubernetes steering committee members. 1 other person is Ihor, and there may be 1 other person from the CNCF that I'm not aware of. I used to be one of the holders of the keys to the kingdom when I was on the steering committee. I helped out DIMS set up sort of automation around management of mailing lists at the Kubernetes using a Kubernetes.io Google Groups admin APIs. It was a fun process that involved a lot of back and forth between the person actually doing the development and trying to figure out what level of access they needed and the person who had the keys to the kingdom. And so it took some back and forth over a few weeks, but we eventually got there, and we have like a single Google Workspace account that's tied to like a service account in Google Cloud that has the appropriate permissions to read and write from Google Groups. It's great. It's awesome. I basically want to do that kind of stuff, but for anything else that the steering committee currently feels like is a toil or a burden for them when it comes to managing the Google Workspace that you have the keys to the kingdom to. Some things that I know are pain points are like the management of the majority of our mailing lists is not great because most of them are on the public Google Groups instead of our Google Workspace Google Groups thing. And theoretically, the automation that like DIMS and I helped develop might just do that, but it might not quite work at scale, and it might not quite provide all of the permissions we need to do this. When we start talking about doing groups with hundreds and hundreds of members, we may end up getting slapped with like emails on GitHub type stuff. But essentially, I want to broaden it from there to be like, you know, I think it'd be really great if every SIG had like a shared drive and documents lived on that shared drive so that we didn't have to worry about documents magically going away when some person deleted them from their personal G drive. Or I want to make sure that like, I don't know, I have this hope and dream someday because I'm somebody who works on Kubernetes. If we could use like YAML to manage our calendars, I think that'd be really cool to do like a GitOps-based thing where we could just open a pull request into YAML file and have it make the calendaring appointments and stuff. So I'm thinking of stuff like that. And then the other thing is just specifically from a K10 perspective, I am finding that there is troubleshooting and introspection that we cannot do because we don't have sufficient permissions to dig into the groups APIs. and a few other things. So when I get pinged with troubleshooting requests for like, why can't I access this particular cluster? I can't use this wonderful tool called like IAM Troubleshooter that can specifically enumerate which permissions a person has, because I'm blocked at the wall of Google Group stuff. In the issue, I have a proposal that I was noodling on a while ago. It's not really fully formed. When I shopped it around, I got a whole bunch of ideas about like, well, what if you did this? What if you did that? And so I'm coming to you hat in hand asking, like, I want to turn that proposal into something that is more fully formed and baked. But in order for me to go do the research to figure out exactly what scope of access I'm asking for, I'd like to get an account as a super admin, specifically because it's kind of a pain in the butt to create new service accounts and then link them to the appropriate scopes for the appropriate level of API access. It's a bit of a song and dance. And I feel like the current 3 holders of those keys are a little bandwidth constrained. I'm trying to provide that proposal and links to all of the things that I could solve as my carrot, and then sort of my time and status as an emeritus member as a way of proving that like I will not go snooping or poking around for things that I should not be able to see. This is all in service of basically being able to figure out what the appropriate scope and level of access would look like for empowering other people to automate away or help out with some of the toil.
And we're at time, Aaron.
Okay, so
Steering, any quick comments? We're definitely not going to be able to weigh on this today. Jordan, do you want to say your question? I can if you are.
I like the idea. I like the goal. My only question in this is lack of knowledge of what this means. Like, what does this mean for private groups?
that is specifically why I'm suggesting I and only I have the permission to do this super admin thing for a bit, because it could be super admins might be able to see that. I don't know. I think I'm just asking, like, if you are willing to trust me that I won't go digging around with that stuff. I'm specifically interested in what will avoid all of that from an automation perspective.
Bob has a hand too.
Yeah, for what it's worth, super admins cannot see it unless they explicitly add themselves to the group. So there is like an audit trail of any of that stuff. It's the same thing with access to like the code of conduct private drive that is not accessible to an admin. They have to be added to the group first to be able to see it.
And that leaves a trail. Yeah,
and that leaves a trail.
That was my main question, and nothing specific to you, Aaron. Obviously, I just due diligence and responsibility. I don't like unaudited things around private stuff. So
completely agree and understand. I don't know what level of auditing y'all have turned on right now, but that's something I'm interested in exploring. Anyway, my TLDR is I got +1s from the 3 key holders of the SCN accounts. I'm not sure what else I need to move forward with provisioning an account and getting me the credentials.
I know we're out of time. I have the context.
We're at time.
I'm happy to take this to the thread. I got my main question asked, so we can follow up there.
Okay.
Last call from steering. We're already over. I just want to make sure everybody's good. All right. And we're done. Thank you everyone for coming to steering today. Steering, we'll see you next week for our private edition. Have a nice day, y'all.
Thanks all. It was so great to see you all.
Thanks.